Across Venezuela, a wave of cautious optimism is sweeping through oil towns and coastal cities alike. The reason? A partnership with China that's breathing new life into an industry the West tried to suffocate. In September this year, something remarkable happened. A colossal floating drilling platform, the Alula, completed its transoceanic journey from Chinese waters and arrived at Lake Maracaibo, Venezuela's historic petroleum heartland. This isn't just another piece of industrial equipment. It represents something far more significant. China's expanding role in reshaping the global energy landscape, one oil well at a time. The Alula's destination is the Lagunillas oil field, part of a massive billion-dollar infrastructure project that Beijing has undertaken in partnership with Caracas. We're talking about two major oil field developments that China now controls through a 20-year operating agreement. When fully operational, with 100 wells pumping simultaneously, these facilities are projected to produce at least 12,000 barrels daily, and that's just the beginning. For Western policymakers in Washington, London, and Brussels, this development represents a strategic nightmare. After investing decades into constructing an elaborate sanctions regime designed to economically isolate Venezuela, they're now watching China systematically dismantle those barriers, project by project, investment by investment. So what makes this particular billion-dollar venture so consequential? And what does it reveal about the shifting balance of power in global energy markets? Stay with us as we unpack one of the most significant geopolitical energy stories unfolding right now. To understand why this matters, we need to first understand Venezuela itself. Positioned at the northern edge of South America, this nation of roughly 28 million people is blessed with extraordinary natural beauty. It's home to Angel Falls, which plunges from heights greater than any other waterfall on Earth. Its Amazon rainforest territories contain ecosystems of stunning biodiversity. But what truly defines Venezuela on the world stage isn't its natural wonders. It's what lies beneath its soil. According to assessments by American petroleum geologists, Venezuela currently holds proven oil reserves exceeding 300 billion barrels. Let that number sink in for a moment. That's more than Saudi Arabia, more than Canada, more than any other nation on the planet. Venezuela sits atop the world's largest confirmed oil deposits. These reserves aren't scattered randomly. They're concentrated in several massive petroleum basins. The crown jewel is the Orinoco Heavy Oil Belt, stretching across the eastern part of the country. This geological formation spans more than 55,000 square kilometers and contains some of the richest heavy crude deposits anywhere in the world. Experts estimate recoverable reserves in this belt alone exceed 28 billion barrels. With such staggering natural wealth, you'd expect Venezuela to be an economic powerhouse, its citizens enjoying prosperity comparable to the Gulf oil states. But reality tells a very different story. Venezuela did experience a golden era, but it ended decades ago. Back in the mid-20th century, when global oil prices soared, Venezuela ranked among Latin America's wealthiest nations. Petrodollars flooded government coffers. The currency held stable. Social welfare programs expanded generously. Per capita income outpaced most neighboring countries by significant margins. Yet this resource abundance never translated into sustainable, long-term development. The economy became dangerously dependent on a single commodity. While oil revenues dominated, other sectors withered. Manufacturing capacity declined. Agricultural production weakened year after year. The entire economic structure became alarmingly one-dimensional. When oil prices rose, everything seemed fine. When they fell, the whole system trembled. But the resource curse alone doesn't explain Venezuela's current predicament. The more devastating blow came from external pressure, specifically the comprehensive sanctions regime imposed by the United States. The American economic warfare against Venezuela didn't happen overnight. It built up gradually, then accelerated dramatically. In August 2017, Washington took its first major step, prohibiting Venezuela from issuing or selling bonds in U.S. financial markets. This effectively slammed the door on Venezuela's access to American capital, making it nearly impossible for the government to raise funds through conventional channels. But that was just the opening move. In January 2019, the Trump administration escalated significantly by placing Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, on the sanctions list. This wasn't a minor restriction. The U.S. government froze approximately $7 billion in Venezuelan assets held in American institutions and banned all U.S. companies from conducting any transactions with PDVSA. Consider what PDVSA represented. It was the beating heart of Venezuela's economy, the primary generator of government revenue and foreign currency. This sanction didn't just hurt, it devastated. In 2019 alone, Venezuela's petroleum sector hemorrhaged more than $11 billion in losses directly attributable to these restrictions. The cascading effects were catastrophic. Oil exports plummeted. Foreign currency inflows dried up. Inflation spiraled out of control. By the end of 2019, over 150 Venezuelan entities, companies, ships, individuals, had been placed under U.S. sanctions. The country was being systematically cut off from the global financial system. There was a brief reprieve. When the Biden administration took office, it adopted a slightly more pragmatic approach. In October 2023, the U.S. Treasury Department issued what's called General License 44, which selectively permitted certain oil and gas activities with Venezuela to resume. Companies could once again legally engage in exploration, production, and export operations with PDVSA, within specific parameters. The impact was immediate. Venezuela's crude oil production, which had collapsed to abysmal levels, began recovering. Output climbed back toward 800,000 barrels per day, roughly 300,000 barrels more than its lowest point. The U.S. also announced limited, temporary waivers for Venezuela's petroleum, natural gas, and gold sectors. While these measures were modest in scope, they at least created breathing room for international partnerships. However, this thaw proved short-lived. When Donald Trump returned to the presidency, the pendulum swung back hard. The administration quickly coordinated with Canada, the European Union, and the United Kingdom to impose a fresh wave of sanctions targeting 8 high-ranking Venezuelan officials, including PDVSA's president and ministers overseeing aviation and security. Then came an even more aggressive move. In April, Trump signed Executive Order 14,245, which declared that starting April 2nd, the United States would impose a 25% tariff on all goods imported from any nation that continued purchasing Venezuelan oil. This wasn't just sanctioning Venezuela, it was threatening any country that dared to do business with them. The message was unmistakable. Venezuela's path to exporting oil through traditional channels would remain blocked, complicated, and economically punitive. But here's where the story takes a fascinating turn. While Western sanctions tightened, another power stepped forward with a very different approach. The Venezuelan people, struggling under economic pressure, found hope in an unlikely partnership, or perhaps not so unlikely given the shifting dynamics of global power. China arrived not with sanctions, but with investment capital, technical expertise, and long-term commitment. Let's talk about the two oil fields at the center of this story, Lagunillas and Lago Cinco. Both are located in the Lake Maracaibo Basin in western Venezuela, an area that has functioned as the country's petroleum production core for generations. Lagunillas alone has an impressive history. Since operations began, this field has yielded approximately 7.4 billion barrels of crude oil. Even after decades of production, it still contains an estimated 1.8 billion barrels of recoverable reserves. But here's the staggering part. Geological surveys indicate that underground reserves exceed 43 billion barrels. By any standard, this qualifies as a supergiant oil field. Lago Cinco presents a different profile. It's essentially an offshore field located within Lake Maracaibo itself, traditionally operated by PDVSA, and known for producing lighter grades of crude oil. During the mid to late 20th century, this lake field generated enormous foreign exchange earnings for Venezuela, serving as one of the nation's most valuable petroleum assets. Then came 2019 and the crushing weight of U.S. sanctions on Venezuela's energy sector. Funding evaporated. Technology transfers stopped. Equipment suppliers withdrew. Oil fields that had relied on foreign service companies were forced into partial or complete shutdown. Production collapsed. By 2021, Venezuela's total crude output had fallen to approximately 500,000 barrels per day, a stunning decline to just 1/6 of peak production levels from the 1990s. Venezuela faced a painful reality, sitting atop the world's largest oil reserves while lacking the means to extract them. They needed a partner, one willing to invest despite Western pressure, capable of providing technology and expertise, and committed for the long term. China checked all those boxes. In May 2024, after months of careful negotiations, a Chinese private energy firm called United Energy Group finalized a landmark agreement with PDVSA. The terms were straightforward, but significant. China would invest $1 billion to take operational control of Lago Cinco and Lagunitas. In exchange, they would receive 20-year development and operating rights. The work began almost immediately. Within months of signing, China deployed approximately 300 petroleum specialists to the Lake Maracaibo sites. Their mission fully revived two oil fields that had languished in semi-dormant status for years due to equipment failures, maintenance backlogs, and funding shortages. The Chinese teams got to work with methodical efficiency. They reopened wells that had been capped. They drilled new wells using modern techniques. They repaired and upgraded production facilities that had fallen into disrepair. They brought in new technology and equipment to replace outdated systems. By July 2025, the results were already visible. Combined output from the two fields had recovered to approximately 12,000 barrels per day, producing both light and heavy crude grades. The lighter crude was largely retained within Venezuela, either processed at domestic refineries or used as blending stock for re-export. The heavier crude, the type China's refineries are specifically designed to process, began flowing steadily eastward under long-term supply agreements. Now, let's put this in perspective. Against Venezuela's total 2025 production of roughly 1 million barrels daily, 12,000 barrels might not sound overwhelming. But this is just phase one. China isn't thinking small. To genuinely revive these fields, Beijing significantly increased its commitment. That's where the Alula comes in. This floating drilling platform was relocated from Zhoushan Port in China, towed across thousands of miles of ocean, and carefully positioned in Lake Maracaibo. When it arrived in early September, settling into position near Lagunitas, it marked the beginning of full-scale intensive operations. Think of it as a mobile industrial base, capable of drilling, processing, and supporting complex extraction operations. The objectives are ambitious. China aims to increase daily output from these two fields from the current 12,000 barrels to 60,000 barrels. Achieving this target requires drilling approximately 500 wells and deploying additional floating platforms similar to the Alula to support expanded development. If everything proceeds according to plan, by 2026 these two fields should be contributing 60,000 barrels of crude oil per day. That would represent about 6% of Venezuela's total national production, a meaningful contribution by any measure, and one that could grow further in subsequent years. For Western policymakers, particularly in Washington, this development represents a strategic setback that's difficult to overstate. As we've discussed, Venezuela's current economic difficulties stem largely from years of coordinated Western sanctions designed to isolate and pressure the government. The goal was clear-use economic pain to force political change or, at minimum, limit Venezuela's ability to project influence in the region. But something unexpected happened. Rather than collapsing under pressure, Venezuela found an alternative patron, one with deep pockets, technological capabilities, and no interest in regime change. China has emerged as Venezuela's economic lifeline, and nowhere is this more evident than in oil trade. In 2024, China imported an average of 350,000 barrels of Venezuelan crude every single day. Over the full year, that totaled 127 million barrels. The monetary value of this bilateral oil trade alone reached $18.6 billion. To circumvent U.S. monitoring of traditional shipping routes and port facilities, many of these tankers employed creative logistics, transshipping through third countries like Brazil and Malaysia, using ship-to-ship transfers, and employing other methods to obscure the crude's ultimate destination. By the first quarter of 2025, the numbers became even more striking. Venezuelan crude oil exported to China accounted for 90% of the country's total petroleum exports. Read that again, 90%. China essentially became Venezuela's oil market. This was precisely the outcome Washington sought to prevent. Instead of cutting off Venezuela's energy revenues, the sanctions merely redirected them. Venezuela's most critical economic artery, oil exports, now flows almost entirely through Chinese channels. The strategic implications are profound. But there's another dimension to this story that worries Western financial policymakers: currency. Under the weight of U.S. sanctions, Venezuela and China adapted by reducing their reliance on dollar-denominated transactions. According to available data, the share of China-Venezuela oil trade settled in Chinese renminbi reached 72% at its peak, and by 2025, this proportion has stabilized above 65%. This matters enormously. For decades, the U.S. dollar has functioned as the undisputed currency of global oil trade. This so-called petrodollar system gives Washington tremendous financial leverage. Countries need dollars to buy oil, which creates constant demand for U.S. currency and, by extension, gives the U.S. significant influence over global financial flows. Venezuela's embrace of renminbi-denominated oil sales chips away at this system. It demonstrates that major energy transactions can occur outside the dollar framework, especially when both parties are motivated to avoid U.S. financial oversight. For Venezuela, settling in renminbi provides a practical escape route from U.S. financial sanctions. For China, it advances a long-term strategic goal: internationalizing the renminbi and reducing global dependence on the dollar. Each tanker of Venezuelan crude purchased with renminbi instead of dollars represents a small but real erosion of the petrodollar system's universality. But the China-Venezuela partnership has evolved beyond simple commercial transactions. We're now seeing genuine technology transfer and joint development projects that indicate a much deeper level of strategic cooperation. Perhaps the best example is the Puerto La Cruz refinery renovation project. This facility had been deteriorating for years. Equipment aged beyond its design life. Maintenance was neglected due to budget constraints. Accidents became frequent. Production repeatedly stopped and restarted as various systems failed. At one particularly low point, Venezuela couldn't even reliably refine the crude oil it was extracting from its own soil. A tragic irony for a country with the world's largest reserves. In 2013, Venezuela assigned the comprehensive upgrade of Puerto La Cruz to Chinese engineering firms. Over the following 47 months, Chinese technical teams essentially rebuilt the facility from the ground up. They dismantled obsolete equipment, replaced corroded materials, redesigned the processing systems according to contemporary standards, and installed modern safety and environmental controls. When the renovation was completed, the refinery's design capacity had increased to 210,000 barrels per day, approximately 17% higher than its previous maximum. What had been a facility on the verge of permanent shutdown was transformed into a modern petroleum processing plant. You could accurately say this refinery was rescued from industrial death. This kind of project goes far beyond buying and selling commodities. It represents infrastructure development, knowledge transfer, and the creation of long-term industrial capacity. Chinese engineers worked alongside Venezuelan counterparts, sharing expertise and training local personnel. The facility itself now embodies Chinese engineering standards and incorporates Chinese manufactured equipment, creating ongoing technical interdependencies. When you step back and look at the full picture, a coherent strategic architecture is coming into focus. China provides investment capital that Venezuela cannot obtain elsewhere due to sanctions. Chinese firms take operational control of oil fields and restart production. The extracted crude flows to China, where it's refined into petroleum products. China pays for this crude in renminbi, helping Venezuela circumvent dollar-based sanctions. Meanwhile, China upgrades Venezuelan refineries, enhancing the country's ability to process crude domestically. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle, a closed-loop system largely insulated from Western pressure. As this ecosystem continues developing and maturing, the effectiveness of Western sanctions diminishes correspondingly. Think about the strategic implications for a moment. The United States invested considerable diplomatic capital, legal resources, and economic pressure to construct a sanctions regime designed to isolate Venezuela and limit its petroleum exports. Yet the primary result has been to push Venezuela firmly into China's economic orbit and accelerate the development of dollar-alternative systems in global energy trade. From Beijing's perspective, this represents a textbook example of turning an adversary's pressure into strategic opportunity. From Caracas's perspective, it's a survival strategy that's working. From Washington's perspective, it's a policy outcome that's backfired significantly. So where does this leave us? The arrival of the Alula drilling platform at Lake Maracaibo is more than just an industrial development story. It's a symbol of shifting power dynamics in global energy markets and a case study in how economic sanctions can produce unintended consequences. Venezuela's oil, which the West tried to quarantine, is now flowing more freely than it has in years, just not to Western markets. China's energy security is being enhanced by access to massive, reliable petroleum reserves located in a region traditionally considered America's backyard. The renminbi is gaining traction as an energy currency, challenging the petrodollar's monopoly. And Chinese state firms are gaining operational experience managing supergiant oil fields that could prove valuable in other resource-rich nations facing similar Western pressure. For countries watching this unfold, nations that might one day face economic coercion from the West, Venezuela's partnership with China offers a potential playbook. Hold on through the pressure, find alternative partners, and wait for the geopolitical landscape to shift in your favor. As China and Venezuela deepen their energy cooperation, as more Chinese drilling platforms arrive, as more wells come online, and as refinery renovations continue, a fundamental question emerges. In an increasingly multipolar world, can any single power still use economic isolation as an effective tool of statecraft? Or have we entered an era where targeted sanctions merely accelerate the formation of alternative economic blocs? The answer is being written in real time, one barrel of oil at a time, in the waters of Lake Maracaibo. What do you think? Will this China-Venezuela energy partnership fundamentally reshape how we think about global oil markets and economic sanctions? How will other nations respond as they watch this alternative model take shape? The implications extend far beyond these two countries. They touch on questions of economic sovereignty, currency dominance, and the very architecture of international trade.